there are a few things that we mourn on the 9th of Av, but the main story is really I don't want to say the main story, but certainly where our focus is generally the destruction of the two temples and the story that links the 17th of Tammuz, which begins a 3-week mourning period that intensifies on Rosh Chodesh, to the 9th of Av. Both 17th of Tammuz and 9th of Av commemorate multiple events that are tragic events in our history, but what links them is the Great Revolt against the Romans and the destruction of Jerusalem in the Second Temple period. Right? So I want to focus a little bit today on that story, or on its meaning, and who some of the characters were. What is the story of the Great Revolt? It's very interesting that this has essentially been faded into the background of our history, of the story we tell ourselves, of the story we teach our children, right? Most people, most children attending Jewish schools in the diaspora don't really learn this story. I mean, maybe part of the reason is that this period of the year is during summer vacation. That, might be a reason why it's not learned, but I suspect it's more than that. A lot of people in yeshivot, a lot of people who spent years and years and years in the Beit Midrash don't really know this story, don't really know what happened, why it's important, why it's still relevant for us, who were the Zealots, what was the Zealot movement, what was it fighting for, what was it fighting against, does it exist today, right? Where did it grow out of? Right now, according to Josephus, and Josephus is the best, but also the most problematic source we have for all this information, because Josephus was a character in the story, and he's a very biased character. He ends up siding with the Romans, and he ends up writing this history in such a way that is flattering to the Romans and vilifies the Jewish freedom fighters. Now, Josephus had allies in trying to...
was he Jewish?
Josephus was a Kohen.
Oh.
He was a Kohen who actually considered himself to be a Navi, and came to the conclusion that the Creator was on the side of the Romans in this war. That what Israel needs to do is surrender to Rome. He probably fancied himself like a Yirmiyahu. Remember, Yirmiyahu, also a Kohen, also a Navi, he was a Navi.
He was a Navi.
He prophesied that Israel should surrender, Judea specifically, the kingdom of Judea should surrender to the Babylonians. Right? That was Yirmiyahu's message to Israel. One of his messages, that we can't win this, that Hashem has decided that Jerusalem will come under Babylonian rule, we should surrender. That was his prophecy. Now, when a prophet tells us to violate the Torah, once we do it, but if the prophet tells us to negate that part of the Torah, we don't do it. Right? Meaning, if a prophet says, this Yom Chamishi, everybody has to eat the leg of a pig, okay, we know it's a proven prophet, and this time, Yom Chamishi, we're going to eat the leg of a pig. But if the prophet says, from now on we can eat pig, we don't accept that.
It's not just we don't accept it, we kill him.
So it's not taken as like the prophet doesn't have the right to change the Torah. The prophet can come in special circumstances and say, okay, we have to violate this in this time because it's what Hashem wants here, and that's the message, right?
Sure.
So if we are commanded to liberate our land from foreign rule always, if we have a permanent mitzvah to possess the land of Israel, right? This is not only a commandment given to Am Yisrael, like when we receive the Torah, this is a commandment that was given to Avram Avinu, right? Like the patriarchs basically had two major mitzvot. They had Brit Milah, and they had possessed the land. Right? Those were basically the two commandments given to the ancestors. We learned that they lived Torah naturally, even before the Torah was given, but what they were obligated to do was Brit Milah and possess the land. Okay? And if Yirmiyahu is telling us, okay, so we're going to give up our possession of the land temporarily, this time we listen to him. The problem is later in history, there were factions of Israel who were taking Yirmiyahu as a source, likely taking Yirmiyahu as a source for why we don't have an obligation to conquer the land of Israel. Right? Even today, this is not something that is universally accepted by the Torah world. I think it's very clear from the sources that we're obligated to possess the land, and we have an obligation to conquer the land if we don't have it, and we're not allowed to give up any of the land. But there are definitely approaches to the Torah that ignore this, negate it. I don't think it comes so much. In my experience, I haven't found that this position that negates the mitzvah to possess the land, is a position based on serious sources, but rather from the fact that this was an irrelevant part of our identity for 2,000 years. We didn't have the ability to possess the land. There were some attempts over the centuries, but they failed. It wasn't a real practical thing. And what became the focus of halachic study was the Daled Amot, the personal mitzvot, Shabbat, family purity, kashrut, chagim, right? This was really the focus of how we, learned Torah for 2,000 years in exile. So, because we have this whole area of our Torah that's unexplored, now it's a problem because it's not just another detail. Learning the laws relevant to possessing the land isn't just another detail of Torah. Like, okay, there's the laws of Shabbat and the laws of this. It's actually the context. Because we're meant to be not a bunch of humans, just observing a religion all over the world. We're meant to be a nation with possession of a specific land that organizes its society according to specific values and laws and ideals, in order that we manifest the divine ideal in every sphere of human behavior, national existence. Right? We have to have a holy healthcare system. We have to have a holy transportation system. We have to have a holy army. We have to have a holy economy. We have to have a holy sanitation system. Right? We have to have a holy government. These are the things that Israel's commanded to do, to be a mamlechet kohanim v'goy kadosh. Right? To be a kingdom of kohanim, like we're meant to be the kohanim to humanity, and a goy kadosh, a holy nation. Right? That's the commandment. To be before we receive the Torah at Sinai, in Parshat Yitro. That's the context. So when approach to Torah lacks this, it's, from my perspective, it's not just that we have a machloket on a specific area of halacha, and okay, maybe they're right, maybe we're right, okay, elu ve'elu. I think in this specific instance, it's not elu ve'elu. I think in this specific instance, there's a mission that Israel has in history, and to get this wrong compromises on that mission. Compromise, the impacts our ability to actually do what we're here to do. Okay? Now, all the halachot are important, obviously. It's not enough just to possess the land. We have to live lives of Torah. We have to live a national life of Torah. But we can't think it's enough to live individual lives of Torah without the national framework, without possession of our land, without the ability to have a holy economy and a holy army and a holy transportation system, etc. Right? These are things that are crucial to who we are, crucial to our identity, and crucial to our mission here. So, Yirmiyahu says temporarily, no. Josephus basically mimics Yirmiyahu and has this position that Hashem wants us to surrender to Rome. That's basically Josephus' ultimate message by the end of the war. That's the way he's communicating. That's his say propaganda, whatever, but I think he believed it. And certainly the way he writes the Jewish war is in such a way that the Romans are, for the most part, good guys, and the Jews are okay too. The Zealots are the problem. Right? The way Josephus presents this is that the problem is the Zealot movement, and that they're like an errant weed. They're just like a misguided minority that actually drove Israel into war against Rome.
What is the Zealot movement?
The Zealot
Name.
movement.
What are they?
Okay, so what are they is the question.
Yeah.
Okay? First of all, it should be known Josephus has an interest in presenting, a positive interest, an interest that maybe we could sympathize with, in presenting the Zealots not as a mainstream Jewish position, but rather as an irresponsible extremist faction that brought the nation to disaster. That's basically his position. Also, our rabbis speak this way to an extent, or some of our Chachamim speak to an extent in the Gemara. They present what they call the biryonim in a negative light. Right? Now, remember, it's very important, two things. Number one, at that time, after the destruction of Jerusalem, when Josephus is writing this history, and when there are certain conversations taking place within the rabbinic world, the Romans are trying to decide. They're not trying to decide. There are different forces pressuring in different directions. But they're basically in a situation where they have to either assume this was just some extremist minority that created the conflict who need to be stamped out, or it's the Jews. Right? Do you have a problem with this, like, terrorist group, or is it the Jews? Is it the whole population? And both Josephus and the rabbis had an interest in protecting the Jewish people from Romans believing it's all the Jews, right? Because there were forces in the Roman Empire who said we have to punish all the Jewish people everywhere in the empire for what happened, because it cost the Romans a lot in blood and treasure. So they want. There are certain people who say we should take revenge on all the Jews, in all the places where they live, in their land and outside their land, within the empire. And then Josephus says, no, it was just that group. And the rabbis are saying the same thing. Now also I think the rabbis understood that we're going into Galut. And we kept fighting, we kept revolting against the Romans, and at a certain point, just for us to survive, we have to stop, because they would have totally wiped us out if we continued to fight as ferociously as we did, pretty much, every generation. So they needed to kind of quash that spirit within us. Now the problem is we ended up buying it ourselves. A lot of the Jewish people ended up buying into this idea that the Zealots were wrong and bad, and created, a situation that brought us to disaster, and that their opponents, whether it was rabbis who opposed them, whether it was the elites who opposed them, whether it was Josephus who opposed them, they were probably the correct ones. That's dangerous. So according to Josephus, the Zealot movement is started by Rabbi Yehuda HaKohen and Tzedok HaPerushi, that they start the Zealot movement around the time of Herod's death. Okay? And Rabbi Yehuda HaKohen is important because his direct descendants will be the leaders of the Sikari, which is the ideological purist Zealot faction. Meaning within the Zealot movement there are many organizations who are often in conflict with each other. Now, according to Josephus, the only difference between the Zealots and the Pharisees, right, he goes through the different philosophies among the Jewish people in first century Judea, And he says the only difference, the Pharisees are what we know to be the rabbis, like the position of the Chachamim in the Gemara.
Like the Haredi or nowadays. More or less.
Not necessarily. I'd say what we know to be the Torah, what evolved as the Torah position,
Okay.
including all the different Torah positions. Right? We can say are the Pharisees. Anyone who accepts the Torah Shebechtav and the Torah Shebal Peh as binding and divine is pretty much in the camp of the Pharisees. That's what the Pharisees basically were, as opposed to the Sadducees, the Tzdukim. They accepted the Torah Shebechtav, the written Torah, but not the oral Torah. Right? So the Pharisees are those who have the Torah, the real Torah, and according to Josephus, the difference between the Zealots and the Pharisees is that the Zealots hold that it's a mitzvah to liberate our land always, to possess the land always. He says that's the difference between them.
Mechanics.
They're basically holding by the Ramban. They're basically holding by what the Torah says, that we have an obligation. The whole book of Devarim, which we're entering now, is all about possessing the land, right? It's all about how we organize our society when we're in the land. Right? That we have to be in our land, and we have to have sovereignty over our land, and we have to organize a society that radiates Kedusha from our land, right? That expresses Kedusha, that expresses holiness from our land, right? So the Zealots are saying we have to fight Rome to free our land. To accept Roman rule over our land is idolatry. That's the position of the Zealots, and according to Josephus, that's what separates them from the Pharisees. And Josephus also says that the Zealot approach, what he calls the fourth philosophy, was the most popular approach in all of Judea, especially among the young people. So it's not just some tiny splinter group. Okay, it's the majority of the people of Israel, the majority of the Judeans are, to a certain extent, supportive of the Zealot approach, especially the youth. Now, I don't think Josephus is correct that it started with Rabbi Yehuda HaKohen. Maybe it was concretized, maybe it was given certain more defining principles, but the Zealot movement is really just the evolution of the Maccabim movement. Because you have to remember, when the Maccabim fought the Seleucid Greeks, the majority of their army was initially comprised of the Hasidim, a group called the Hasidim. Now, the Hasidim were willing to fight for Shabbat. They're willing to fight for our calendar. They're willing to fight for learning Torah. They're willing to fight for Brit Milah. They're willing to fight for the things that the Greeks had outlawed in our culture and our practices, and our folkways. But after a few years of fighting together, shoulder to shoulder with the sons of Matityahu and their followers, the Maccabim, the Hashmonaim, it became clear that the Hasidim were fighting to live according to our culture and our values freely, and the Maccabim were fighting for more than that. They're fighting for that, but also for political self-determination. Also that we should be free in our land to govern ourselves. And when there came a contradiction, meaning when Lysias, after the battle of Beit Zachariah, after the siege in Jerusalem during a Shemitah year, which is devastating for us, he offers us peace, but we have to be part of the empire. We can live according to the ways of our ancestors. We can live according to our own calendar. We can have Rosh Chodesh. We can have Shabbat. We can have Brit Milah. We can learn Torah. But we have to be part of the empire. The Hasidim said yes. The Maccabim said no. Right? And so that machloket, later the Hasidim evolve into the Prushim, into the Pharisees. And the Maccabim, the ideological movement of the Maccabim, it evolves into the Zealot movement. Okay? Now the problem is that the Hasmonean family, meaning the family of Matityahu, specifically the descendants of his son, his second son Shimon, become the royal family of Judea, the Hasmonean kingdom, which is a problem because they're Kohanim, and Kohanim should not be Melachim. But Josephus claims to be a direct biological descendant of the Hashmonaim, the Hasmoneans, of Shimon and ben-Matityahu. So you have a situation where because the descendants of the Hashmonaim became part of the Judean ruling class, they didn't necessarily continue in that revolutionary ideology. There were some who did, and they were forced out, and the Romans came in and actually, I don't want to get into the whole story of how we lost the Hasmonean dynasty and replaced it with the Roman puppet Herodian dynasty, but basically the Romans, at that point, a lot of the Hasmoneans who were resisting this transition, who were resisting the Roman presence, had kind of rediscovered, we can say, or maybe they were always loyal, it's a good question, to the Maccabee ideology, the Maccabean tendency towards revolution and towards liberating our land and not accepting foreign rule in our land. But certainly we could say the Zealot movement picked up on pretty much what separated the Maccabim from the Hasidim separates the Zealots from the Pharisees. Okay? Although there's one thing that I'll say became more pronounced in the time of the Zealots, and that was the issue of class. Like the Maccabim, I think in the time of the Maccabim, there was a feeling, and there was sometimes, there were moments when it was weaponized rhetorically that, the wealthy Judeans are kind of with the empire, they're collaborating with the empire, and they have certain privileges, and it's really the poor, the rural poor, the urban poor, who were more likely to revolt and to fight against the Greek occupation of our land. Now, it's true. I mean, it's not 100% true. I'm sure there were wealthy Judeans who were on the side of the Maccabim, and there were, I'm sure, people from the lower classes who collaborated with the empire at certain moments. But with the Zealot movement, the issue of class becomes more central. And it's not just that the rich Jews collaborate with the empire and the poor Jews want to fight the empire. It's also specific critiques of how society is organized and how wealth is distributed and the inequality that existed in Judean society, and of course, those who are most privileged and those who benefit from the way society is organized tend to be those who are closer to the Romans. Remember, the Romans ruled our land. The Romans basically appointed the Kohen Gadol, right? The Romans basically gave privileges. And, you have the Herodians and the upper class Kohanim, and you have certain sectors of Judean society who are more privileged, more elite, and that privilege comes from a certain proximity to the Roman Empire and to its vision for our country, its will for our country. Whereas those who are not doing well, those who are living in poverty, and there were a lot of people living in poverty specifically because a lot of Herod's works programs, which had been employing a lot of people, a lot of laborers, when they came to a close, when they stopped, a lot of laborers found themselves to be unemployed. Also, there was some difficult years in terms of just lack of rain and famine and bad agricultural cycles, and the combination of those things, high unemployment and bad agricultural cycles, really created a situation where a lot of Judean society was impoverished and destitute, and it wasn't like there were all these social programs to help people. So you have a situation where one of the first moves made by the freedom fighters when they start to push back against the Romans militarily is to burn the Hall of Debts, to eliminate debt, because at that point, a lot of the poor were deeply indebted to the wealthy. And so we burn the whole of debts. There's no record of the debts. It's basically liberating all of the poor of the country from their debts. And that was I think it was, well, I don't think it was just like a populist move to get more people on the side of the freedom fighters. I think it was something that they believed in, that they believed this is wrong. The way the society is structured and organized is wrong, and it's not fair, and there are tremendous wealth gaps, and there's tremendous inequality, and it was connected to the Roman presence. Meaning they also came, like the Maccabim, they also came from the perspective that we have an obligation to free our land. We have an obligation to possess the land. And therefore, there's this combination among the Zealot movement, there's this combination of the national struggle with the class struggle.